Because
yeah.
Hello, everyone. We are officially live. So good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Zoya Patel. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting on stolen lands. So we're broadcasting from the stolen lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people, as well as the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra. And we pay respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nation people tuning in tonight. And I would also like you to take a moment to stop and acknowledge the lands on which you are on right now and acknowledge elders past and present of those lands. It was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I dive straight into the really exciting part of tonight, which is chatting to Jessie Cole, I'll just give you a little bit of background as well. So this session is being held by Express Media, which is an absolutely awesome, very vital organisation, which is essential to the literary arts and broader communities in Australia. It is acknowledged and valued as the peak organisation for young Australian writers aged 12 to 30. And for the past 30 years, Express Media has been developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, and through awards and programs that recognise excellence. So Toolkits, which is the program that this session is being held under, is a rigorous 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. I will say that online environment is sometimes a little bit fun, like tonight we've had a lot of tech issues, but thankfully we're all here and ready to go. Each of the Toolkits programs includes one-on-one mentoring and feedback from an established writer and specialized presentations from guest artists and the opportunity to network with other young people working in the same literary form. So this session is part of Toolkit's Memoir. So we've had an excellent, I think almost 8 weeks so far of talking about all the different aspects of writing memoir. And we're really excited to have Jessie Cole with us today as another excellent writer of both fiction, but also memoir, which we'll be talking about shortly. So these Toolkits live sessions are presented by Express Media in partnership with Regional Arts Victoria as part of the Arts Connect series, which is funded by the federal government's Regional Arts Fund. So a big thank you to those guys for making this possible. So welcome. That was a lot of intro spiel. I'm sure you're as excited as I am to just hear from Jessie. But a little bit of background on me. As I said before, I'm Zoya Patel. I'm a writer and editor based in Canberra. I am the founding editor of the independent arts and feminist journal Feminazi, and I'm also a memoir writer myself. My book, No Country Woman, which is a memoir of race, religion, and feminism, was released last year. You can get it at all good bookstores and online, of course, because we are moving in the digital world. And for the first time this year, Express Media has offered Toolkits Memoir, which I'm the facilitator of. And Jessie Cole is our second guest presenter for the session, and she is going to speak to us about writing family, but also just generally about memoir and the lessons that she's learned as a writer herself. A little bit of background on Jessie. Jessie grew up in an isolated valley in northern New South Wales, where she still lives in her childhood home, which, if you have read Staying, her childhood home sounds like the most awesome and strange and wonderful environment ever. Her first novel, Darkness on the Edge of Town, was shortlisted for the 2013 ALS Gold Medal and longlisted for the Dobby Literary Award. Her second novel, Deeper Water, was released in 2014 to much critical acclaim. And her 2018 memoir, Staying, has been shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards. And Tim Winton described it as a wounded, lovely, luminous book about grief, trauma, and the strange healing potential of words, which is such an awesome way to describe the book. I couldn't have put it better myself. If you would like to ask Jessie any questions, feel free to tweet them to @express_media, which is the Express Media account. And if you use the hashtag EMToolkits, we'll be able to pick those up. So, Jessie, that was a really long introduction. So excited to have you here tonight. Thank you. I wanted to ask you, first of all, about the kind of journey to actually writing this book. So for people who haven't read it, Staying is a really incredibly vulnerable memoir. You write about family, but it's also, a lot about grief, and you deal with themes of mental health and suicide. So there's a lot that's kind of unpacked throughout the book. And I want to get to all the different writing techniques that you use as well, because I think you structured it in a really awesome way. But first of all, how did you know that you wanted to write this book and that you were ready to do it?
So the process of writing Staying was really idiosyncratic, I think, because as I explain in the book, I didn't really realize that I was a writer, and I started writing it through a therapeutic process. And that was strange too, because my therapist had sort of suggested that it might be helpful for me to write things down. And I think she expected me to do journaling or that sort of thing. But what actually came out when I started to write things down was these whole set of kind of stories that were written in third person, strangely. So like, and they were each one was kind of like a perfect little thing that could just be something on its own. But and I'd write one and then I'd let it sit for a couple of weeks, and that story would seem to point to another story. And it was only when I was sort of 3/4 of the way through this process of writing these stories that I kind of realized that it was a sort of a body of work. So the whole process was quite accidental. And at that stage in my life, I had no concept of publication or concept of the publishing world at all. So it was more that I realized that I had something that represented a life up until that point. And so I was about 26 when I started doing that. And so, I guess I didn't have any profound kind of realizations that I was ready or anything like that. I just did it quietly in my own time for therapeutic purposes.
What's interesting about that, though, is you wrote 2 novels and had those published before this book. So what was the process for that? Or did you decide that you wanted to kind of sit with the memoir for longer and that's why you turned to fiction for a time? Or have I completely misjudged how the whole process kind of unfolded?
Yeah, no, it was more that the memoir as it stood when I was 26 was quite, well, it was written in third person, so it wasn't like a memoir. It was like a weird sort of middle ground kind of work.
Yeah.
And I had thought that I would just write that work and then I would put it in my drawer and then I would get on with my life. But what actually happened was, when I sort of wrote that first draft when I was at a real high point in my life, and I was feeling really optimistic about my capacity to like, I felt quite healed, and now I shall go forth and I shall be free of this story. And what happened, of course, is that I sort of hit the next load of obstacles in my actual personal life, and I had gotten so used to managing my emotional material this way that I started to write this very strange text, which was told from the position of a man, which in my life was the man that I loved. But in the book, it took on a completely fictional slant, like none of the events happened. But it was just a way that I learned from this quite long therapeutic process to manage like difficulties, really. And this book came out very quickly. I mean, it came out, the novel, the first novel came out very quickly, and it came out kind of fully formed. And I sort of was like, oh gosh, like what is this, And at that stage, I had won a Varuna HarperCollins Manuscript Development Award, which is a thing that doesn't exist now, but did exist at that time. But I'd won it for the memoir-ish type thing. And so I went through this process with them, and in the end, they didn't take the memoir up. Like, I think that they were concerned that it was sitting in this awkward place of like being autobiographical but not being a memoir, and so they weren't sure what to do with it. But they said, have you got anything else? And I said, oh, I've got this other thing that I've done, and they published that. So it looks like, I published each novel and then I was ready to write the memoir, but that's not what happened. I was always trying to get the memoir to what it could be throughout that whole time. It just took a really long time. It took about 15 years.
That's really fascinating. I think you and I have opposites, where I actually wrote a novel first, which signed me to my literary agent, which got shopped around and did have an offer on it, but I mentioned that I was working on my memoir, and that also got sold. So it was one of those funny things where like it looks like I wrote the memoir first because
Mm,
that's the thing that's come out, but actually, other projects were happening at the same time. I think
yeah.
that's so often the case with writers.
Yeah, that's right. It's really invisible what's happening behind the scenes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it does sound though as though the original form of the memoir is quite different from the form that it has been published in.
Yeah, yeah.
What was that like, having to kind of unpick what sounds like was a very kind of natural flow of content? It sounds as though, when you sat down to do that journaling process, it came quite easily, or there was a lot that was already kind of sitting there. And then it looks like you've had to kind of unpick it and rewrite it in a different way so that it is more first person. Was that a weird process to go through, or was it quite natural?
No, I think it was a horrible process.
Yeah.
I think that the writing it in third person was a really helpful sort of technique in dealing with trauma, because it made the story something that existed outside of me, and it made it more universal, and it made it not something that was. I felt like I used to carry this story around my neck like this huge, anchor that's this, and it weighed me down and I couldn't move. And so writing this story in third person, it was like I could just lift the anchor off and just put it away, and I felt this sense of lightness. And so then when I went to try and write it back into me, it felt that bad. It felt like putting the anchor back on, like it was very traumatic.
Yeah.
And it was just very difficult. So it was both things. And it took
that would be a lot of actual work as well.
Yes,
there's the emotional labor, and then there's also the physical hard work of actually trying to form something out of all those words.
And that's the thing. And also, I think it can sometimes take a really long time to see what the story arcs or whatever of your own life are. And so it's just, it's not like fiction. It's so different in that you don't have that degree of clarity. So it took a really long time to, like, say my memoir opens with, it doesn't open, but it has, at the very beginning, it sort of has these lines about trust. That that my relationship with trust was damaged, and so it took me. And then at the end of the book, it sort of rediscusses that relationship with trust. But it was only like 15 years after I'd written the book that I kind of realized that was what had happened. So all of that stuff was really hard too, and it required a degree of self-examination that no one wants to do. Like, why would you willingly enter into that process?
I think that's actually quite funny, because there's this stereotype culturally that you write memoir because you're like super self-obsessed, and it's actually like, memoir to me is like it's an exorcism. You're taking stuff out because you need it to be somewhere else. And I totally get that. But that said, you do write about some really difficult emotional topics that most people wouldn't have a lived experience of, and in that sense, it's such a powerful and moving book. But when you publish a book, you're then expected to talk about that book for a ridiculously long amount of time. And even when you're not writing memoir or topics that are particularly personal to you, it can still be tedious and frustrating to have to do that again and again when, you as a writer mentally moved on from that work because you're not working on it anymore. How did you approach doing the kind of promotion in the media and the engagement, like you're doing right now, I guess, with readers about your memoir, especially given, the trauma that's at the heart of that story?
For me, it was it was sort of like the final, if you read Stain, you'll sort of realize that a really big part of the trauma for me was that there was no cultural space for me to exist. Like, as a person who had experienced these things, I either had to sort of like wipe all visible trace of my history so that I could move forward in the world as a reasonable person, a person who could be reasonably received, or I couldn't be reasonably received with that history. It's how I felt in a cultural sort of outside of the forest, which I lived in space. So the way that I viewed the publicity and that sort of stuff around the book was that it was the first opportunity I'd really ever had to be a visible person with this history, and to be standing there with this history and viewed and held and received by people. And I mean, the tricky thing about that is that it doesn't always go your way, in that if the material is too difficult, then sometimes people get up and leave. Or, you know, I've had some media stuff that's quite painful in that sense, because the space itself, for whatever reason, isn't all that safe, you know. So, and that does happen. But, you know, primarily it hasn't happened that way, and it has provided a space that I've never had, that I feel really like, you know, happy and relieved, and like a sense of belonging that I didn't really have without having gone through that process. So primarily for me, it's been really good. The only thing that happens now is, I think that that because the book has been out for a year, and because I've been doing this sort of thing for a year, that now it often happens that I will just get overcome with like tears or whatever, in a way that I wasn't in the beginning, as though my body is kind of like not able to manage the emotional material in the same way. So I have all these kind of rousing moments, and I have no control over them. But I kind of think I don't try too hard to inhibit them, because it's not inappropriate that I should be upset talking about stuff. So
absolutely.
It's not bad. Yeah.
And I think part of it is that, you know, as much as it might have felt at times when you were writing it that you could take that anchor off from around your neck and hang it up, I guess the reality is that you're still Jessie Cole. You're still, you know, living through every new week and every new month of, you know, life without your father and your sister, and you're still living through your life, even whilst people are able to take a section of your life that you've written about in your book and digest that. You know, like it exists on either sides of the cover. And I think sometimes that's the thing that people don't necessarily know about or understand about memoir when they're reading it. And it's probably one of the things that's most important to know when you are contemplating writing memoir as well, that the way in which people will consume your life when they read it is really different from the way that you will continue to experience your life as you kind of go on and keep living it.
And it's not visible to people, and of course it shouldn't be, and it's not visible to people what you've had to cull from your life to fit it into a you know, a reasonable sized story. So you know, I do think that people get really sure that they know you really well from reading the work, and in some ways they know this intimate part of yourself that you've allowed to be seen, but in other ways, like they don't know, you know, a third of the stuff that you've actually experienced. So yeah, that can be confusing as well, I think.
Yeah, totally.
It definitely is something that I experience, that people feel a kind of intimacy with me when we haven't met, and and I mean, that's mostly actually lovely, especially if you've spent as much time as me, like in a state of isolation, you know.
Yeah, totally. I do want to come back to that kind of interaction with readers. But you have mentioned your location a few times, and it makes me think about how totally unconventional your upbringing was by kind of mainstream standards. So two things. First of all, I would love for you to describe your family home to people who might not have read the book yet, because I think you describe it so beautifully. But I also want to know about how you chose, I guess, how you would portray your childhood, and if you ever felt concerned that people would, you know, judge your parents or not understand what they were trying to achieve with this much more wild and free kind of upbringing that you describe in the book.
Okay, well, so this is not my house, because my house doesn't have good enough internet to do this sort of thing. So
I was going to say that looks like a very ordinary house, which is not what I have in my head.
Yeah. So my actual house is, I mean, it wasn't originally a forest, it was pasture. And my parents bought this amount of pasture, and then they built a quite experimental house that had it has a walkway down the center and all these rooms that come off the walkway. And then in between they planted a garden. I mean, they saw it as a garden, but the thing is that 40 years later, it's now a forest, and it completely engulfs the house. And so you have to, and all the walls that face the gardens are glass, because they're all made of sliding doors, and they all open as well. So it's this very inside outside experience. You get wet if it's raining and you need to go to the toilet, because you have to go outside, and you get wet just going from room to room. And so, yeah, and around that whole property is a really beautiful creek system with lots of swimming holes and stuff. So we basically just kind of like climb down the banks and get into the water.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, so it's really unique, I think. In terms of the portrayal of my childhood and if I was worried about the way it would be received, I really wasn't so much. I mean, the thing is that that first draft that I wrote when I was 26 that I wrote in therapy, those memories felt really fresh to me at that age. And so recording them at that age felt really natural and felt really immersive, especially since I was doing it within this therapeutic process that was quite, it was called the Alexander technique, and it wasn't just talk therapy, it was like a body therapy. So she would lie me down on this table and she would sort of talk about, releasing tension in my body. And often when there were parts of my body that she was working on, it was like they would hold a memory that was very like, it was very sort of clear, and intense. And so they were the kind of things that I was recording. So to me, they felt very like, it wasn't like I was trying to recreate something. It was just something that was very sort of right there for me. And in terms of all of that, the hippie sort of stuff, it's very different for me because my whole community was like that. And so I don't feel judged, like at all, because all of my peers at school had exactly the same kind of experiences. What I get shocked about is when I go out into the world and realize not everybody else has lived this way or had, so I didn't even realize that my childhood was unique until I got my first book published and had to start doing publicity and touring around on, festivals and stuff. And then I would talk to people and realize that I had come from this really quite unique sort of space, cultural space,
Yeah.
So, but I didn't feel the need to defend that or defend the decisions that they'd made because, that was just what was happening in that era. Yeah.
And
And
I
also
think,
my parents were like my dad's dead and so I didn't feel like I needed to sort of defend his character. And my mum who's living, she doesn't mind.
yeah,
I
yeah,
did.
totally.
I always tell this story because she did. I read a piece once at a reading where I was talking about how she was always in her sarong. She was never in clothes, and she was at the reading, and I saw her lean towards the person beside her and she said, "I wore clothes most of the time," and I thought,
I
oh,
love that. I love that so much. I also think, the way that you write about your family and the way that you write about your childhood is just filled with so much warmth and richness. I particularly love the way that you describe those, the parties that your parents would throw, and you just get this wonderful image of that era and that that time, but also the warmth of that community that you guys were in. And part of what I think really brightens that up or kind of creates a real sense of immersion for the reader is that you're writing through the lens of your childhood eyes. So now that I know that you wrote it in third person originally, I'm even more fascinated by how you chose, I guess, which Jessie we were seeing the story through. Did you deliberately start through that childhood lens because it's largely chronological in terms of a sequence of events, or did you do that for a more, I guess, like a different purpose? Why did you choose to have that separation in your perspective through the ages as we kind of progress through the book?
I think a really big problem for me was coming to terms with how the experience I'd had as a child pre my sister's death, so I was 12 when my sister died, how the experience of my life, which in my memory was so beautiful and so um, loving and so fun, and how once my sister took her life, it was as though the whole of our family history was somehow tainted, which obviously, so like if someone makes that choice, then everyone for the rest of the time asks you, what went wrong, and and it's as though your family has some kind of horrible secret that has caused this behavior, and everyone wants to know what it is. And for me, I didn't know what that secret was. Like I didn't experience it that way. So I guess I was trying to recapture a sense of what it was like to be a child in that environment, and also to, in a sense, like pay homage to the care and love that we received, and and make a claim, like, like if you've lost family members, I think it's true. If you've lost family members to suicide, everybody believes that your family is broken and
Yeah.
was broken in some way. So it was like, you know, just, and I'm not saying that it wasn't, like, I'm not saying that there weren't things that happened for my sister that would have been really terrible and painful for her, but that wasn't my experience. So I guess I felt like my memories of childhood had been completely wiped by this act of hers. And I was trying to reclaim them, and also to reclaim her, because that's the other thing, is that she was such a monumental influence on my childhood, because she was such a huge character. And then after she died, no one ever spoke about her. It was like she was gone, like she was wiped from history as well. So
Yeah.
it was like, how do I explain that I was formed by this relationship with this difficult and tremendous and terrifying older sibling, when
Yeah.
she's been wiped from history? And so, yeah, a combination of all of those things.
Did you have kind of source material that you could rely on to bring those memories to life? Did you
I
have
mean,
journals or things like that?
yeah, we have an enormous amount of photographs, because my dad took a huge amount of photos, but I didn't really look at anything like that. I really felt like my memories were. Oh, the other thing is, I should say, is that I suppose that when my sister died, she had some stuff like that, like we had those, whatever they were, like dozen letters that she'd written home, but we also had old diaries and things like that. And so, as a younger teenager, or like post her death, basically, I spent a lot of time obsessing about these things and wanting to know about her, and wanting to. So it was very embedded in my memory, I suppose, a lot of that information. And same with the photographs, because in my family, I don't know, this shows how narcissistic I was, but we had a lot of photo albums, and one of my pleasures as a child was to look through them, sort of endlessly. And sometimes I wonder if that's why my memory is so good, because I was constantly being reinforced by these, endless photo albums. So yeah, I didn't really feel like I needed to revisit that stuff. It was really just very present for me, but I could have needed to. Yeah,
I find that incredible, because it reads with such an immediate sense of your emotions, like as the events are unfolding, and your reflections are beautiful, but the kind of early chapters where it does read as if you're there are really strong. So I think that's testament to your memory, definitely.
Yeah. Everyone in my family is outraged, because no one else remembers anything, and I think my mum hoped I would never remember anything. So
that's so funny. I know that I felt a lot of pressure when writing my memoir and kind of featuring my family to do justice to, I guess, like their version of events. Did you talk to your parents, your mum, I should say, and your other siblings about wanting to write this book? And I suppose the book itself was written in a more kind of organic way, but at the point at which you had publisher interest, did you have to broach that with them in some way?
So my three remaining sort of family members, my mum, my brother, and my sister, all read that early version. So when I was about, I probably I was about 28 or something. And it was really beautiful, because up until that point, none of us had really talked about any of the events that had happened. Like, that's sort of what had happened. We'd all been enveloped in silence. And so the book was just a way that it all became like out there, like, rather than not. And so it did sort of begin a lot of dialogue around those events, but never in a sort of never in a, like, it didn't work that way, or that isn't what happened, or anything like that. I mean, sometimes I had factual inaccuracies or whatever, and it would be pointed out. But even that, it was just my memory versus their memory. So, and then, I mean, they were all really open to the idea of it being published, but of course I also just never thought I would be published, because who is ever published, and I'd been living in the, like that wasn't part of, it wasn't really a concern, and so I suppose when the other books were published and it became closer and closer, I became more agitated about, how they, especially because the book had changed so much from then, and both of my siblings didn't want to reread it. They basically just said, I trust you, it's fine, which was, I think, quite terrifying. I felt a lot of responsibility, and and then my mother was the same. So I think that everyone always asks me questions around that as though it would have been a very difficult and sort of loaded area, but it really wasn't. And part of that, I think, is that my sister lives in Japan and has for the last 30 years or something. So, the publication of the book doesn't really impact her life over there very much. And my brother has always had this very strong kind of point of view, which is not unsurprisingly after you've read the book, which is I'm glad the story is out there and I don't have to talk about it.
Yeah.
So it's like he felt that it was better for him that people knew that this had happened, but that he wasn't having to manage that dialogue, which is, the book actually talks about this as well. It is, these sort of conversations are really hard to have with new people, and with people that don't know you very well and stuff like that. So he felt it was a good thing. I mean, I was definitely quite terrified, but it hasn't ended up being as bad as one might expect.
I think that's also, I also think you're totally right that people always ask about how family responds to memoir as if there's like juicy gossip and details that we've left out, especially because when people read memoir, they start feeling as if they really know your family as much as they know you, if you are writing about your family. I always joke that people who have read my book are kind of like a fan club for my parents now, and like there's like in my publishers and my agent are always like, oh, like Mr. and Mrs. Patel, will they be at the launch? Like really excited. And I remember for my Canberra launch party, because I live in Canberra, so my parents came to that one saying, please don't try and talk to my mother. She's lovely, but she's a bit socially anxious. Like she won't want to engage. And my dad will be like handing everyone business cards, like networking the crap out of it, because that's what he does. But people assume the same thing, that it would have been a difficult conversation, and it was in different ways, but never in the way that people seem to expect. And I think that that's an interesting thing about memoir. There's probably a lot of fear in writers when they are talking about aspects of their lives that, either their family might not feel comfortable with or might not know, or it's a shared experience of trauma, that's going to be the hard part. And it certainly wasn't for me. For you, what was the unexpected joy of having this book out there, and maybe an unexpected challenge that you wouldn't have known about until it was actually on the shelves?
I mean, the joy is not having to find a way to tell people this story, which dogs me to this day, is trying to find language with people that don't know you very well to explain what's happened to you. So I really love that has just been taken out of the equation entirely. I don't know. I guess, I mean, I've had some really beautiful messages from people that knew my dad before I was born. And also people who knew my sister or who were peers of hers. And I really love that, because it's like they were so incredibly sort of disappeared by the way that they died, that no one comes and tells you those stories because they don't want to make you sad or whatever. So having this influx of new stories, like I got some emails from people who had been to university with my dad, like
wow.
when he was like 17 or whatever, and sent me his university picture and his some photos and things like that, and they were just so beautiful, and I just loved having those memories back, really. I mean, I got a message yesterday from this boy who, well, he's probably a man now, he's probably like 50, but he had been on the school bus with my sister, Like, and so he'd read the book and he said, it was a whole email, but there was this one line he said that he still remembered the electricity when my sister got on the bus, the electricity that went through.
Oh, wow.
And I just felt like so moved by it, because it's like, I almost feel like, because they were so monumentally disappeared, it's almost like I made everything up, you know, and I had no proof that she was really that spectacular, you know.
Yeah.
And also I was a child, so maybe she was just spectacular to me, you know.
Yeah.
So I love getting those kind of messages and realizing that, you know, I wasn't alone, that the book was electric when she got on, you know.
I love that description because it so aligns with the way that you describe her and you know the character of her, which I guess is the other weird thing about writing memoir, is you and the people in your life become characters for the purposes of the reader, which is a kind of like a weird thing. Was there anything that you found challenging in the process that you didn't necessarily expect to find challenging, kind of outside of writing the book, which obviously would have been challenging in both logistic and kind of emotional senses, but has there been anything that you've been a bit like, about as you've gone through the process?
I don't know. I read a good review. I mean, not that you should ever read your Goodreads review, but I read one yesterday or the day before that said, this is seriously, it said, after the second tragedy, I stopped relating to any of the characters in this book, and the story fell apart for me.
And you're like, that's my life, mate.
It's like, they're not characters. You know, and I was like,
I didn't invent a second tragedy.
You know? But yeah, it was just, I suppose it is that difficulty occasionally of coming up against the reality that your life is now art, you know. Yeah, so you know, and it's not really, like, I mean, it's still your life, and those people aren't characters to you ever.
No, and you can't rewrite the plot if you want to.
Yeah,
you know, it's not a choice.
Yeah, so I wasn't offended at all, and I was like, well, this is the kind of person who would have not wanted to talk to me after these events because my life, you know what I mean? Like, that would read the book that way. So, you know, but it was just, it's just sometimes coming up against that, you know, I suppose it's easy for other people to read it and think it's a story.
Yeah.
Which of course it is in some ways, but you know, it's also not.
Yeah. You're right though, that like, to me, that incident kind of reminds me of the absurdity of having your life in a book that you have written, and like you've chosen to share it, but there's still these moments where you're like, you know, I remember going to work recently and I had my hair curly, and you know, my hair's straight right now because I straighten it, but in my book I write about how I started straightening my hair as this kind of reaction to feeling too thin and wanting to kind of make myself whiter. And so I walked in with curly hair and my boss was like, oh, look at your hair, it's so, or somebody else was like, your hair's so curly, and I was like, oh yeah, I just straighten it because it's easier. And one of my bosses who had read my book turned around and was like, well, that's not really why you straighten it though, is it? And I remember being like, oh my gosh, I can't even white lie anymore. Like, you know, there's all this stuff that people know and you can't control it. And I do think that's one of the kind of weirder, funnier things about memoir is, you know, there are parts of you that will change, but for other people, they'll stay fixed in time in a way that you can't control. Do you feel like
it's
sorry, go ahead.
For me, because the book is mostly set so long ago. So for me, those times are sort of are sort of fixed in a way as well, because they're so far back. You know, because the present text of the book is really when I'm about 26, so it is quite a long time ago for me. So yeah, I definitely don't run into that so much, but I definitely know what you mean. Yeah.
Do you ever find though, and I'm curious in what your thoughts are on this, there's a real attitude that you get one memoir per life, or, you know, memoir as a literary form is often conflated with autobiography. And I personally find that really frustrating because to me, memoir is about using personal experience to explore deeper themes or, you know, a broader meaning than just these were the things that happened in my life. So do you feel like there's scope for more works of memoir from yourself? And do you think that...
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel, especially because my book ended so long ago, And really, it ended on I mean, it might not feel like that to those of you who read it, but it ended on a kind of high note for me. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't really know what was going to happen next in terms of, I mean, the next sort of mountain I had to climb was leaving the forest and meeting new people, and and the complexity of carrying that. It's hinted at, I think, in Staying, but it's not actually. I mean, it's hinted at in quite an optimistic way in Staying, but in reality, it was really, really challenging, and still is challenging. So, yeah, I don't feel like I'm finished at all.
Yeah.
And I really love that concept. I was reading lately the Deborah Levi, the Cost of Living, which she
Oh, yeah.
describes as a living autobiography. And there's three installments so far, and I really love that idea. I mean, it
I
was
love that too.
yeah, that you don't that you make, because I use writing to make sense of
Yeah.
things I don't understand. So, and things that I'm really grappling with in my actual life. So, I mean, it's such a pleasure to use that tool in your actual present life rather than just applying it to the past. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I totally agree with you. For me, writing memoir is a way that I just I reflect on things and I tease stuff out. And I don't want to lose that opportunity to have that conversation out loud, because I think, the most fulfilling thing, certainly in my experience, and it sounds like for you also, is having that connection with your readers where you get a chance to turn that, the monologue into a dialogue, which is something that as writers you don't always get a chance to do. I'm curious about your experience though, because you've written fiction and memoir. Have your engagements with readers in the aftermath of having this book published versus your previous two books published, it would be really quite different, I imagine. What did that feel like? Were you expecting one thing and got another, or have you just had to accept that Jessie Cole, the novelist, is probably going to be, feel distinct from Jessie Cole, the memoir writer?
I don't. Well, the thing is, for me, it was very strange to publicize and talk about those novels without talking about what had happened in my life. But if I talked about what had happened in my life, then that would have like completely sort of swallowed the novels, which aren't dealing with exactly the same material and whatever. So it always felt like a kind of slightly stifled conversation for me, because I was trying to not let my life story take over the stories as they were that I was writing about in fiction. The thing is that I don't feel like there's a huge amount of difference in writing fiction and in writing non-fiction. The only problem with, I mean, non-fiction is less pleasurable because you are tied to the truth, and fiction is such a delight, because you can use all the same kind of emotional material, but you can take it places that you haven't been able to in your real life, and you can resolve a lot of emotional sort of stuff in ways that you just don't get opportunity to do in your real life. So for me, they're totally different experiences in terms of the writing, and one like sort of overtly more pleasurable than the other. But in terms of the publicity, I almost feel like found it quite hard to talk about my novels as though they were abstract and not related to me. I know lots of authors don't like to like they like to see their fiction that they've created as something that you could just talk about without relating back to you constantly, and that's fine. But I guess I just didn't really feel like that, especially because both of them came out of my life so specifically that I mean, it doesn't feel that different, is all I'm saying.
I feel like maybe that's a bit unique for you because, like you said, you have drawn on your life experience. I do know a lot of writers who get really frustrated when it's assumed that their work is autobiographical. And often that happens to, I guess, women more than it happens to men. So that's actually quite an interesting point that you make.
And I really love that I think it's Tennessee Williams who said his work was emotionally autobiographical, and I feel that so strongly. So like nothing about my novels is actually autobiographical, but
Yeah, I love that actually. I'm definitely going to look up that quote because I think it summarizes how I feel about, the line that we draw between fiction and memoir is so often quite arbitrary. And that's a clever way of putting it. So I also wanted to ask what your actual process is like, because I know that a lot of people are curious about how writers actually write. It seems like such a straightforward thing, but like, what does a writing day look like for you? Do you have a process that you like to go through, or do you squeeze it in around other stuff? I know you have kids, so that might actually mean that your writing moments are snatched in between a whole bunch of other things that you have to get done.
I always feel so bad talking about this because I am the world's most undisciplined writer. I have no routine. I am just really, really undisciplined. And I can go for huge amounts of time without writing anything and then sit down and write like huge amounts of words in a couple of days. And I mean, the longer that I've been writing, the more I feel like I need a writing routine. But I think that's partly because I'm more and more and more battling my own fear about exposure. Whereas when I was a beginner, I didn't think I would be exposed, so I had no fear, and so they were completely not connected. And so the way that I wrote as a younger person was very joyful. And at that stage, I had young children, so I had children who were like 4 and 6, and they were very demanding. So it was sort of, well, they were normal kids. So I had to write around them, and every little minute that I had to myself that I could use in that way was like stolen and beautiful and incredibly precious. So what I found now is that my kids are now like 21 and 19, and they are completely independent and not reliant on me. And well, not completely probably, but they I don't seem to be able to, because I'm not forced in the same way as I was to like steal all these moments. I have so much more trouble getting anything done. So I feel really ill-equipped to give anyone advice on writing stuff. I just went to Varuna for 2 weeks, the writer's house in the Blue Mountains.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, and I wrote, and I had such an, I mean, I've been there a lot, but I had such an amazing time, and I got so much done, and I was just astounded by the person that I was when I wasn't completely, completely kind of sort of being relied upon by all these multitudes in my home. So
I know that feeling well. I always feel, so I've been to Varuna 3 times. I'm very lucky. And I always feel like I'm the writer I aspire to be at Varuna.
Yeah.
And then I come home and I can't do it.
No, I know. So every single time I come home and I think I'm going to bring what I've learned from Varuna back to my home, and it's going to be good, and I'm going to have this all down. It's going to be great. And I don't know if I've never succeeded in doing that. But
I think it's a magic place. It's like a writer's version of the room of requirement in Harry Potter, where somehow it's like everything that you need in that moment as a writer just seems to like be there, and you have that mental space, that mental energy to do it.
The mental space is incredible. Yeah. It's just incredible. So I don't know how to, I mean, I guess you have to, so many people who have so much busier lives than me manage to do things, and you just have to be quite sort of, have a lot of, I mean, I think writing is all about perseverance, and it's also about forgiving yourself when you fail.
And when it's just not happening.
For myself.
No, I get that. I totally get that. You mentioned then, or maybe an answer ago, you used the term beginner for your writing, which I thought was really cute, because we don't really think of writing as like a sport where you kind of go from like beginner to intermediate to like advanced, or whatever it is. But it touches on this kind of imposter syndrome aspect to staying, where you kind of mention it a little bit, like in I think it might be in your author's note at the end, where you talk a bit about the process of writing the book, or it might even be in the book. It's been a while since I read it, I'm not going to lie. But I loved that we got this insight into you actually realizing that you could write, within that space. And I found it really heartening, because I don't think a lot of writers are willing to own that novice aspect of what we do, that, we're all just people who start writing, and if we're lucky, our words kind of make sense together and they flow in a way that other people want to read them. how did you overcome that sense of, I guess, like worthiness when it came to the point where you were actually submitting your work to places and, you know, submitting it to that manuscript development program, for example? What was it that you told yourself that enabled you to actually take that leap?
Yeah, that was so long ago now. It's hard for me to remember. I mean, the first person that I ever gave that first draft of what became Staying to, you know, he was a friend of my dad's, and he was a very, like, it's like I chose the most difficult possible reader. And the first thing he said to me is, you know, I think this is, you know, a good book, but you will never be published. Like, no one is ever published. So just, as long as you keep that in mind, then, you know, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think because I was sort of starting from that point, and in my world, like, I know it's hard to imagine now with the internet and stuff, but I didn't have the internet. And I didn't know about the writing communities, and I didn't know any writers, and I didn't have any sense of a writing world at all. So for me, the concept of, you know, like, being published was so far-fetched and so out of reach, and so, like, it's almost like I believed writers were like witches or, you know, unicorns. Like, they were just fantastical. They weren't actually real, even though I was surrounded by books and I read all the time, and obviously someone wrote them, but, like, I just didn't have that grasp of it. So I kind of feel like when I was first submitting, it was like my degree of disbelief over the concept of becoming a writer, or of writers even being real people, or, you know, was just so high that it didn't feel that risky. You know, I mean, it didn't actually feel risky until I got the first offer, you know, because up until that point, it just felt like impossible, you know. And so the funny thing happened to me when I got the first offer for the first novel, where I've told the story a little bit, but I was in Brisbane with my family, and I received a phone call to say that it was, you know, sort of going to happen. And I was really excited on the phone, you know, for about 10 minutes. And then I had to get my mum to pull over in the Logan McDonald's car park so I could dry reach for like 20 minutes. So, you know, I sort of, I guess, felt, until that moment, it had just felt like I wasn't concerned or having to deal with issues around my own worthiness or any of that kind of stuff, because it was such a pipe dream that it was just not even possible. So when it became actually possible, that the reality became it, that it's like all of those feelings that other people have, like, you know, during that process, just came on to me in one big go, and I was totally overwhelmed and horrified.
That's so right. The stakes are so much higher at the point at which you might actually get published, because I think you're right. Like, all writers, we tell ourselves, oh, it's never going to happen. You know, you're more likely to get rejections. There are all these articles out there that are like, just prepare yourself for a constant litany of rejection. And actually, at the point at which something great happens, you realize that despite that fear, you've just been plugging away and, like, sending things places and writing. And it's the hard work, I think, that is actually what makes a writer, not whether or not you get published, but whether or not you kind of persevere and actually keep putting words on the page. I also hope that if there's one quote that lives on from tonight, it's that writers are like unicorns. I love that. You're right. Such a rare breed. Absolutely.
But, you know, like, I think if I'd lived in Melbourne, or I'd had some proximity to the writing crowd, which, you know, I love and I'm immensely excited by, I would have felt completely differently, but I just had no access at all.
Yeah. Well, I think that's even more testament to your ability to tell a powerful story and get it out there then. We only have a few more minutes of the public live session of this before we, you know, move into our special session just for the Toolkits participants. So I wanted to ask you one last question for everyone who's tuning in, which is, I guess, you know, it's probably really trite, and I'm sure you've answered this before, but I'm curious, what impact do you think the book has had, and is it the impact that you expected it to have?
I don't know about what impact it has had. That's, like, especially from where I am, you know, in the forest still, like, with not really any. I can't see any of that sort of anything like that. But in terms of what I hoped that it would have, I mean, I suppose for me it's that simple thing of opening a conversation. You know, I mean, I think it's a lot better now. I was really interested when I read Axiomatic about how much sort of conversation went on between those sort of communities when a young person took their life, and because that just was not occurring at all for me when I was that age. So I was really fascinated to see that shift, but I still think, despite that we have enormous trouble managing everyday conversations about grief, and especially about grief if there's some kind of trauma, if it's an unexpected death, or if it's if there's some other aspect to it. I just think culturally we're across the board kind of terrified, and so I would hope that the book just made that less frightening for people, and also sort of invites people in a sense to try. You know, I mean, I talk about it and people, I mean, I just loved every person who tried to talk to me, you know, when I was first grieving, because I was obviously very difficult to talk to and very sort of distressed. But and you know, people make ridiculous attempts, like they will kind of, but compared to the people who don't make any attempt at all, I always just sort of, I just loved every single person who stepped forward and said something awkward and embarrassing. And, you know, I guess I just wish that there was, I hope the book opens conversations even if they're awkward and embarrassing. And
yeah, well, I guess how else will we know how to form a language around grief unless it's through sharing of stories like this? Because really there's no, especially I think in Australian culture, we don't really have a agreed upon way to look at grief or to talk about grief. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for your contribution. I will see you on the other side because we'll continue this chat. But look, thank you everyone so much for joining us. If you have any further questions or you just want to kind of stay in touch and find out more, I'm sure you can find us both on Twitter. And Jessie, I will talk to you in just a moment with the other Toolkits participants.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.